Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank the Senator from Alaska for her leadership on this issue. This is an important debate to have. And I want to remind my colleagues what this debate is about, because I've heard lots of discussion on the floor today about how this is somehow about the science of climate change. This isn't about the science of climate change. Maybe we ought to have that debate. Perhaps that's something that we should debate, but that's not what this debate is about. This debate is also not about some of the other issues that have been thrown out here, like, well, this is about big oil, or this is about the Republicans wanting to delay or protect somehow the status quo. That's not what this debate is about. This is a very simple, straightforward question. That question, Mr. President, is, do we, the United States Senate, want to be on the record with regard to the issue of whether or not the EPA ought to move forward and try and regulate CO2 emissions under the Clean Air Act, or should we wait until Congress takes up and deals with that issue? Now, it's ironic about what my colleagues on the other side are suggesting in this debate is there have been a lot of people who've gotten up here on the floor and said, well, the Republicans just want to delay. They want to delay because they don't believe in the science. Well, we don't control the agenda. The Democrat leadership controls the agenda. They have a climate change bill that they could bring to the floor, and we could debate it. They don't want to do that, because they don't want to put a lot of their Democrats on record on that vote. So what do they do instead? Well, we allow the EPA, a bunch of unelected officials, unelected bureaucrats, to move forward and do something that would have tremendous consequence to the American economy without hearing from the United States Congress. Now, I think that's in a very simple, straightforward issue what this debate is about, Mr. President. It's about, do we want the EPA to move forward with the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions absent direction from the United States Congress, the people's representatives, or do the people need to be heard, their voices heard, through the debate that we ought to be having here in the United States Congress? Now, I will say that irrespective of what you believe about the science behind climate change and whether or not human activity is contributing to it, one thing we know with great certainty, and that is it will have profound economic impacts on the American economy. And everybody,
for a question.
And everybody, I would be happy to yield the conclusion of my remarks to the Senator from Massachusetts, but I've got some things I would like to get through if I could before that. Mr. President, what's important in this is that everyone acknowledges, including the Obama administration, that moving forward with the EPA regulating CO2 emissions under the Clean Air Act would cause the economy to suffer. And I want to quote something that the Office of Management and Budget put out last August in a document. It said, regulating CO2 under the Clean Air Act for the first time is likely to have serious economic consequences for regulated entities throughout the U.S. economy, including small businesses and small communities. Now, you look at the impact on small businesses, farms, and ranches, and the proponents are going to say, well, EPA they're not intending to regulate smaller entities like that. We just want to get the big polluters. Okay, we started at 100,000 tons. Well, in 2012, we moved to 50,000 tons. I would argue, Mr. President, and it's supported by statements that have been made by folks in the administration, the EPA administrators indicated that by 2016, they intend to regulate smaller emitters. If we get to 2016, because what's going to happen? This so-called tailoring rule is going to get challenged in the courts. And when it does, it will likely get overturned, because the Clean Air Act said the threshold for regulation is 250 tons. At 250 tons, you don't get just the big emitters. You don't get the large polluters. You get over 6 million entities, to include farms, ranches, small businesses, churches, hospitals. You go right down the list. That's what happens when you regulate at the 250-ton level. Now, as I said, they're saying that's not going to happen. We've got this tailoring rule. Well, Mr. President, the law is very clear. The Clean Air Act, if you're going to use the Clean Air Act as the authority to do this, the Clean Air Act stipulates 250 tons. That captures a whole lot of entities that strike at the very heart of the American economy. Now, the cap and trade legislation that was passed by the House last summer and has yet to be voted on here in the Senate, there's been a lot of analysis of that done in my state of South Dakota. The Public Utilities Commission of my state suggested that if passed, that would increase power rates in states like South Dakota by 50%. And if you look at what the actual impacts are going to be on small businesses across this country, not only because of the cost of the permit, the original construction permits that would be included in this, but also operating permits. The Wall Street Journal said in 2007, or I'm sorry, they said in a story in May of 2009 that in 2007, the Clean Air Act cost those who had to apply for permits $125,000 per permit and 866 hours to obtain. So whether you subscribe to the notion that this is only going to apply to large entities or whether you subscribe, as I do, to the belief that this is ultimately going to cover a lot more smaller entities who are going to be adversely impacted and deal with much higher power rates, I think it's pretty clear that whoever is covered by these new regulations is going to be faced with a lot higher costs when it comes to permits, a lot higher costs when it comes to the implementation of best available technology, and therefore a lot higher costs to the American consumer who will deal with the burden of that when it is passed on by these various emitting entities. Now, my state of South Dakota, of course, is composed of a lot of farmers and ranchers. Agriculture is a 45% energy-intensive business if you look at the inputs that are necessary to make a living in a farm or ranch operation. That means that 45% of a farmer or rancher's costs are going to be increased by this backdoor energy tax imposed by the EPA. The fees and fines that are placed upon machinery manufacturers, energy companies, and fertilizer companies starting in 2011 and 2012 will be immediately passed down to the farm and ranch families who are going to be impacted by this. Now, if the EPA is forced to regulate at the statutory 250-ton threshold, which, as I said, once this is litigated, I believe that's what the courts are going to find, farms with as few as 25 dairy cattle would be forced to apply for a Title V permit and pay a fee for each ton of greenhouse gases emitted by their cattle. The cow tax. That's what this is about, Mr. President. This isn't about, as I said, the science of climate change. It's not about Republicans wanting to delay. We don't control the agenda around here. It's not about big oil. It's about small businesses. It's about family farms and ranches who are trying to make a living, trying to create jobs in this economy, and constantly having Washington stand in the way and throw new hurdles and new impediments and new obstacles and new barriers in their way. And so, Mr. President, what the Murkowski resolution does, very simply, is forces us to answer a fundamental question, and that is, should Congress be acting on legislation that would direct these activities, or do we allow a bunch of unelected bureaucrats at an agency downtown move forward with regulations that would impose massive new costs on the American economy at a time when we're trying to create jobs and get this economy back on its feet? That is the straightforward, simple question put forward by the resolution from the senator from Alaska. And I hope that my colleagues here, irrespective of what they think about the science of climate change, irrespective of what they, all the other arguments and the things that are trying to be used as a distraction here on big oil and Republicans delaying this debate, when you get down to the fundamental issue, that's what it is. It's the question of whether or not this Senate wants to be on the record about allowing a bunch of unelected bureaucrats to move forward with the regulations that would impose massive new costs on our economy, not just on big emitters, not just on large polluters, by the way, who again are going to pass those costs on, but directly hitting the small businesses, the farms, the ranches that are the very backbone of the American economy. And this is not, by the way, Mr. President, just a Republican issue. There are lots of Democrats who have weighed in on this, and there are lots of Democrats, I believe, here in the Senate today who I hope would be willing to support this resolution. But I want to read for you very quickly here, because I know my time is running out, a couple of things that have been said by Democrats in the House of Representatives. Colin Peterson, who is a congressman from Minnesota, has said the Clean Air Act was never meant to be used for this, but they're trying to do it anyway. Most everyone I've heard from about this thinks that elected officials, not EPA bureaucrats, should decide how to address our energy problems. John Dingell.
His time has expired.
John Dingell called this a glorious mess if the EPA moves forward with this. And I've got other statements here from Democrat members of the House of Representatives, Mr. President, which I'd be happy to submit for the record, as well as a letter from a bunch of organizations in my state supporting the Murkowski resolution. I yield my time. I hope my colleagues will support this resolution.